Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Getty Villa for today's program. My name is Sarah Cole. I'm an Associate Curator of Antiquities here at the Villa, and I'm very pleased to welcome you. Today's program complements one of our current special exhibitions here at the Getty Villa, Sculpted Portraits from Ancient Egypt. This exhibition features sculpture from a time of intense artistic revival and renewal in ancient Egypt, the 26th dynasty, which lasted from 664 to 526 BCE, and is also known as the Saite Dynasty after its capital city of Sais in the Nile Delta. Egyptian artists from this period made striking portrait statues of officials who were associated with the royal court and the priesthood. This period was also a time of intensifying contact between Egyptians and Greeks. Around 610 BCE, under the Saite pharaohs, the Greeks were allowed to establish an emporion, or a trade colony, in the western Nile Delta called Naukratis. And Naukratis is the subject of today's program. So after hearing from our speaker today, I encourage all of you who are present in our in-house audience to go into the galleries and visit this exhibition with fresh eyes. The galleries are open until 5 p.m. And for those of you who are on Zoom, you can access more information about this exhibition and the objects in it on the Getty's website. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Camille Acosta. Dr. Acosta is an assistant professor of art history and archaeology at UC Irvine, where she specializes in the archaeology of migration in the ancient Greek world and cross-cultural interactions in the Eastern Mediterranean in the first millennium BCE. She's involved in archaeological projects in Greece and in Egypt, and together with Ross Thomas and Alexandra Villing, she has co-authored the upcoming book, Naukratis, Egypt's Cosmopolitan Port City, British Museum Excavations from 2012 to 2019, which presents the results of recent field work in Naukratis, and her work at Naukratis will be the subject of today's program. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Acosta.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Sarah, and thank all of you for coming inside on a beautifully sunny Sunday afternoon here in Malibu. I know that's hard. Even though we're going to be going back in time to look at ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, I think it's so appropriate that we're here today in Los Angeles, a major global port city, and one that's been home to generations of immigrants who came from all around the world. Some of these immigrants include my grandparents and my mom, if you could spot her on the right, who sailed here from Japan in 1958 on board a cargo ship called the America Maru, seeking out new opportunities in a foreign land where they had never been before, where they didn't speak the language, or where they didn't know the culture. And as Sarah mentioned, I'm really at heart a Greek archaeologist, but growing up here in LA, in this multicultural city, drew me to this topic of these Greeks in Egypt. Both as a child of immigrants and as an archaeologist, I always wondered what it must have been like for these Greeks. Who were they? Why did they decide to leave home? And how did they feel when they sailed down the Nile, encountering new people, new objects, and new landscapes? So in the present, when you walk into a museum, like the one we are in today, we often find objects organized by period or place in their separate galleries. So if you just go out the door to the right and into the main entrance of the museum, on your left, you'll have Gallery 104. So this is archaic and classical Greece, and these are all the villa's own permanent collection. On the right, as Sarah already mentioned, you'll find a temporary exhibition of sculpted portraits from ancient Egypt, all made during the 26th or Saite Dynasty. And these are all on loan from the British Museum until next year, I believe. And even though we think of two cultures, right, Greece and Egypt, as separate entities, today I want to highlight the ways that they were actually connected. So first, I'm going to give you a little brief bit of background on the Saite Dynasty and its connections with the Mediterranean, bringing in some of the objects you can see in the exhibition. And I recognize this is a huge, huge topic, so I'm going to be very, very brief. Because what I really want to do is try to focus on these people who lived in Egypt, these Greek merchants and mercenaries. So again, as Sarah mentioned, I'm mostly going to be talking about the site of Naukratis and excavations there. And unfortunately, I hate to say, there are no objects from Naukratis here. But I've included some objects that are on display in Gallery 104 that are actually quite similar to what we would find at the site. So you can go look at those as well. And anything that's on display here today in the villa, for all of you who are in the audience, will have a white box around the caption. So that means you can go find it afterwards. And at the end, I'm going to finish with some new results of the fieldwork that I've been involved in Egypt, run by the British Museum. So to hopefully give you an idea of what a Greek settlement in Egypt actually looks like on the ground, or as we will see more accurately, in the mud. Before we go on, I just want to briefly go over where we are for those of you who aren't as familiar with the ancient Mediterranean. So I'm going to try not to bombard you with a lot of different places and names. So I'm just going to show you a couple of the locations that I'm going to mention. So first, when I say Greece, right, there's a lot of different city-states that make up the ancient Greek world, but I'm mostly going to be looking at the East Greek city-states. And the central region of this is called Ionia. So this is islands in the east of modern Greece and the western coast of modern Turkey. And this is really the home of the majority of the Greeks that we're going to be seeing today. On the Egyptian end, we're mostly going to be staying within the Nile Delta. This is exactly where the river Nile fans out into several branches and ends up in the Mediterranean. And of course, East Greece and the Nile Delta don't exist in isolation. They're two parts of a much, much broader Eastern Mediterranean world. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of the names of other regions you'll see me mention today. So first is the region of Caria in southwest Anatolia. This is very near the East Greek and Ionian city-states, but an area that has its own language and culture. We're going to hear a lot about the island of Cyprus, really at the crossroads of the Eastern Mediterranean world. We're also going to hear a little bit about the Phoenicians who live along the Levantine coast. And finally, in terms of when, I know that most of the time when I say I'm talking about Greeks in Egypt, people immediately think of Alexander the Great and his conquest of Egypt and the establishment of the Ptolemaic dynasty. However, we are actually looking at a period that's about 3 centuries earlier than this. So no Alexander yet. Oh, there you go, the Saite Dynasty, the 26th dynasty. So of course, I also want to emphasize this is not the start of contacts between Greece and Egypt either, which had been particularly robust, perhaps, for example, in the 2nd millennium BCE, but which ceased during the 3rd intermediate period, a time when Egypt was fragmented, ruled by different dynasties in different regions, and at times subjected to foreign rule. So this period of instability also had limited contact with the Mediterranean. But this all came to an end with the establishment of the 26th dynasty, which, as Sarah mentioned, has its capital at Sais, which is why we refer to this interchangeably as the 26th or Saite Dynasty. You'll hear me say both. And here at the villa, you can go around the corner and get a taste of some of the sculpture that was commissioned at the time. And a lot of these pieces probably did come from the capital of Sais itself. And at Sais, we have the main cult center of the goddess Neith. So she's the figure you see standing in the shrine of the sculpture here. So these Saite pharaohs, they not only oversaw this reunification and revival of Egypt, but as part of this, they turned to the Mediterranean. From this position in the Nile Delta, they reestablished trade with foreign lands, engaged in diplomacy with foreign rulers, and at times, we hear, made donations at Greek sanctuaries. And this is the context we have to keep in mind when we first think about these Greeks who actually came to live in Egypt. So the story begins with the very first pharaoh of the Saite dynasty. In Greek, we call him Psammetichus. In Egypt, Psamtik. And honestly, as a Greek archaeologist, I find the Greek easier to say, so that's what I stick with. Then he opened up Egypt first to foreign traders, and also part of the reason he came to power was thanks to his use of foreign mercenaries from Ionia in East Greece and nearby Caria, these regions we saw in Anatolia. And throughout the Saite Dynasty, we also hear of other pharaohs in this period who retained these foreign mercenaries as part of their armies. So one particularly fantastic example that relates to the exhibition is this piece you can see here. This is a statue of a royal treasurer. And thanks to the cartouches you can see on his chest and shoulder, we know that he served the Saite pharaoh Psammetichus II, who ruled a little bit later. And like his predecessor, Psammetichus I, he also had foreign mercenaries in his army. And we know that one of the events of his reign was an expedition he led far, far to the south, to Nubia in modern Sudan. And while Psammetichus and his soldiers went down to the south, they stopped at the temple at Abu Simbel. And like many generations, were presumably bored and carved their names into the legs of the sculptures. Yes, it's an eternal thing. Mostly these are names of individuals. So these are individual soldiers whose names are not only written in Greek and Carian, but also Phoenician. And interestingly, one of the people mentioned on these graffiti is also named Psammetichus. So this Egyptian name, Psamtik, that was the same as the pharaoh. But this particular individual also records that his father was named Theocles. This is a Greek name, suggesting that at least by this point, we might have second generations of mercenaries. So this is perhaps the son of someone who originally came at the beginning of the Saite Dynasty, but at some point decided to adopt Egyptian names. And this inscription is also interesting because it mentions that the non-native speakers, so Greek, Carian, and Phoenician foreigners, were kept under the command of one officer, and the Egyptians under the command of another in separate units. And to some extent, we do see a degree of separation between these foreign communities that once they actually stayed in Egypt and settled more properly. At the site of Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt in modern Cairo, written sources refer to Greek and Carian quarters of the city, perhaps reflecting some of the same separation we've already seen. But we have plenty of evidence pointing to their participation in Egyptian life, their ability to participate in Egyptian cult, and to gain high status in Egyptian society, their capacity as cross-cultural individuals to mediate between these two different cultures. We have a small handful of votive dedications, so gifts made to the gods, with Greek language inscriptions from Egypt on Egyptian objects. So I have two examples here. The one on the left, again on the bottom, has a Greek inscription dedicated to the sacred Apis bull, who was particularly popular, seemingly, among these foreign communities. And we have other types of inscriptions and documentary evidence that mention individuals who held important roles within Egyptian society, so as royal advisors or translators and other administrators. And like Psammetichus, we have other individuals that have Greek parents, but Egyptian names themselves, who we assume would have been familiar with both cultures. So maybe someone like the dedicator of the statue base I have on the right, which was inscribed in both Greek and Egyptian, which equates the Greek god Zeus with the Egyptian god Amun. And it's from the area of Memphis, we also have objects that fuse these different cultural traditions, Greek, Egyptian, and Carian, seemingly made specifically for this multicultural community. And this gravestone, which is in the British Museum, has an inscription, which is a little hard to see, for a Carian woman. Her name is running between the registers, written in Carian script. And for comparison, to understand what we're seeing here, I'm going to bring in this stele, which is in the exhibition. So you can go see this one, which belongs to an Egyptian man. So you can see the general similarities in form, the kind of rounded top, and some iconographic similarities as well. So both have the winged sun disk at the top, and both have a similar scene at the top. So we have an individual in front of a table bringing offerings to Osiris, the Egyptian god of the dead and of the afterlife. So you can see the similarities to it already. And in the middle of the Carian stele, we also have another thing that might be familiar to you, that same sacred Apis bull. But the bottom register is very different, and we have something decidedly un-Egyptian. And on the bottom, it's a little hard to see, but we have the deceased woman laying on a bier, on a funerary bier, surrounded by mourners. And if you've been to the villa before and seen Greek art, this might look familiar to you, because this is one that is very common in Greek art specifically. The lamentation over the dead body. This is something used for centuries in Greek ceramics in particular. So objects like these really testify, I believe, to this multicultural environment at Memphis, created by and for these immigrant communities, these mercenaries and their descendants, who brought their own cultural traditions with them and commissioned these hybrid works of art that fuse Greek, Egyptian, and Carian elements. So we're going to leave Memphis now, get on our boat and sail down the canopic branch of the Nile to the site of Naukratis. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BCE tells us a little bit more about this site. He tells us that the Saite pharaoh Amasis, slightly later pharaoh, that he was a great lover of the Greeks, which he showed in various ways. And one of these ways was the grant of Naukratis, a city to live in, to certain Greeks who came to Egypt. And if they didn't want to settle in Egypt, if they were just passing by and making voyages, he gave them land where they could set up altars and sanctuaries to their gods. So here we're seeing something quite different, right? Rather than being settled in an existing city like Memphis, we have Naukratis, which is completely founded anew around 610 BCE. And this was to serve as the main port, connecting the Nile to the Mediterranean, through which foreign trade could be controlled and taxed by the Egyptian state, while also allowing traders from the Eastern Mediterranean world access to the wealth of the Nile. And even though this written source, this text of Herodotus, survived the centuries, the actual location of the archaeological site was not known until 1884. The Egyptologist Flinders Petrie was sent on a survey of the Nile Delta on behalf of the Egyptian Exploration Society. And while he was there in Cairo, he was at the local antiquities market, and someone brought him this figurine to sell. And when Petrie saw this figurine, he thought this was a Carian mercenary. Right, so he asked, well, where does this piece come from? And they mentioned this village of Nibira. And he was, after a couple weeks, able to actually get out to Nibira. So this took him 2 days, but now by car it's about 3 hours. And when he finally made it out to this village, he said he found a feast of pottery, that the whole ground is thick with early Greek pottery, and that he felt like he was wandering around the smashings of a museum base room. It's very evocative. And he filled his pocket with scraps of vases and statuettes, and eventually had to leave the site behind. But he left just longing to solve the mystery of these Greeks in Egypt. So actually, at first, he didn't realize this was Naukratis, even despite all the Greek pottery. But when he did return to the site a year later, he encountered a stone inscription that mentioned the name of the site. And in his diary, he said, "I nearly jumped. This is Naukratis." So pretty much immediately after this, Petrie began excavating. This was followed about 2 years later by another season where he went back to the site with Ernest Gardner. After this, there's about a 10-year hiatus before the archaeologist David George Hogarth, who at the time was the director of the British School of Archaeology at Athens, decided to take over for 2 more seasons. But this is the 19th century, so I just want to give some caveats for people looking at this material. We have to keep a few things in mind when looking at the 19th century excavations at the site. So when the excavators first arrived, they would have been confronted with this huge mound of mud brick that you can see in the photo. But actually, this ancient mud brick, which we call sabak, it's a very, very rich and organic material. And that means it actually makes a very good fertilizer, surprisingly. So a lot of this mud brick was actually already being dug away by individuals we call sabakin, who take this material and use it in agriculture. So this damaged both Naukratis, but also many other sites in the Delta. And this was a known issue at the time. So there was some amount of damage before archaeologists even arrived. And when they conducted excavations, it's obviously not the same as the way we conduct excavations today. So they hired up to 200 workers to go around the site. And in addition, were buying objects from the Sabakin to make sure they didn't go sell them in antiquities markets elsewhere. So keeping the objects at the site. But so obviously very different excavation methods and techniques. But they did bring back a lot of objects. 18,000 or so objects to be precise, which are now found in about 70 museums around the world. So this is a lot of material in a lot of different places. Since these excavations, there's been much less research at the site. A small project that took place in the 70s and 80s. And then more recently, the British Museum excavations from 2012 to 2019. So when we talk about Naukratis, I'm first going to show you some of this 19th century material, and then show you some of our new excavations. But when we look at the site, I have to say, you have to use a lot of imagination. Okay, so stick with me. Because since these 19th century excavations, this whole mud brick mound you see was dug away. So if you were to look at a satellite view of the site today, you can see this hole in the middle, basically, which was that mud brick mound. And it's usually filled with water. So it actually makes a little shallow lake. So we call this the lake depression. So this is roughly the area where they would have excavated. So again, as I say, you'll have to use some imagination. I'll show you some more images. So a lot of these buildings that were mapped in the 19th century are not there today. So in these old excavations, the archaeologists uncovered 4 Greek sanctuaries to Greek gods. So one dedicated to Aphrodite, one to Hera, one to Apollo, and one to the twin horsemen, the Dioskouroi, as well as one more enigmatic structure known as the Hellenion. In the southern part of the site, they also uncovered a monumental mud brick enclosure wall that later would be identified as a sanctuary to the Egyptian god Amun-Ra. So there are other areas of the site that are more or less well recorded. So there was a cemetery in the north, which is not terribly well documented. And other objects sort of are loosely described as coming from the town or certain houses at times. There are a couple other spine spots, and the only one I'm going to mention is the scarab factory, which you can see just above the sanctuary of Aphrodite. So I'm going to now take you on a little tour of the site. But really, I'm just going to show you the sanctuaries of Apollo, Aphrodite, and Amun-Ra. Don't have time to go over every single part of it. But I want to keep in mind that this is a trading town, so that these religious institutions also have certain economic and administrative functions at the same time. So all of these Greek sanctuaries are not equally well preserved, especially given, as we'll see, that most of this architecture is mud brick. So this is very, very difficult to excavate in this region. One exception to this rule, actually, is the Temple of Apollo, where architectural fragments in both limestone and Greek marble were recovered, representing the remains of a small Ionic temple and altar. But from these sanctuaries, we really have the votive offerings, these gifts people made to the gods. And these are overwhelmingly ceramics. From the Apollo sanctuary, we have hundreds of inscriptions like this that record the name of Apollo himself. And across the site in general, the mud brick architecture tends to be poorly preserved. So when the archaeologists are identifying these sanctuaries, it's often on the basis of these inscriptions, so finding a collection of inscriptions in one place. And for Apollo, we actually have about 460 inscriptions naming the god. And the other reason I chose to highlight the Apollo sanctuary is because we have about a dozen arrowheads from the site. So maybe a hint that some of these Greek mercenaries ended up ultimately settling here at Naukratis, or at least deciding this was an appropriate place to make a dedication to the far-shooting god archery. But I also really wanted to show you the Aphrodite sanctuary for 2 reasons. Partially, it's very, very rich. It has an incredible assemblage of votive offerings, and also so you can see some of this mud brick architecture. So this temple was created in mud brick, and very well documented by Ernest Gardner. And this was rebuilt at 3 different times. And in the rebuilding, they dumped all of the old sacred trash. So in the successive layers, we have accumulations of votives, bones, charcoal, ash, and all this sort of sacred rubbish. And probably the most famous finds from Naukratis And these are from the Aphrodite Sanctuary, but also as in the Apollo Sanctuary, we just have hundreds and hundreds of fragments of inscriptions and decorated Greek ceramics, mostly from East Greece, like the bowl on the right. And on the left, I've put in a piece here in Gallery 104, which is produced in a similar style from around the same place and time, so you can go see that one. And the reason I decided to bring in this bowl, it's because these inscriptions and ceramics are probably the most well-known finds from Naukratis. Not least because there are in total about 2,800 inscriptions from the site. Around 1,300 are dedicatory, so an offering to the gods like this. So these inscriptions are quite brief, generally. They just tend to say, so-and-so person dedicated me to such and such god. But these inscriptions can tell us a lot about the people who came here. They're mostly written in the Ionian script and dialect, so individuals from East Greece. Sometimes they do say where they came from, and these also generally tend to be East Greek city-states like Chios, Teos, Mytilene, Phaeacia, though we occasionally have some outliers like someone from Syracuse on Sicily. And these names are mostly male, but we do also have a handful of female names as well, and a very, very small number, just a couple, Cypriot and Carian inscriptions. But again, these are very, very rare compared to the Greek. And one of my absolute favorite groups of imports to the site, which were very popular in both the Aphrodite and Apollo Sanctuary, are Cypriot figurines, which I love. So here in the villa, you can go see the Cypriot alabastron on display. And an alabastron is a small, thin vessel which was used to hold perfumed oil. These are originally an Egyptian shape, but small perfume containers about, of this size and shape were popular commodities that were made in different locations all around the Mediterranean and very widely traded. Right? They're very, very small, valuable, and very portable. So you can see on the right from Naukratis, we have very, very similar ones to what we have here in the villa, as well as absolutely hundreds of figurines that were produced in similar workshops. And coming back to Petrie, if you remember that apparently Carian mercenary that he found, he was not quite right. It's actually a Cypriot figurine. But I think one of the reasons he was a little bit confused is these Cypriot figurines tend to incorporate Greek and Egyptian and Near Eastern in addition to traditional Cypriot motifs, reflecting the location of this island at the intersection of these maritime trade routes in the Eastern Mediterranean, and probably the desire of these workshops to make these products that would really appeal to a multi-ethnic clientele. And I also have to mention the figurines because a Cypriot figurine plays an absolutely starring role in one of the best stories from Naukratis. And this is recorded by a later historian. So he tells this wonderful story of a merchant who's named Herostratus from Naukratis. He was out sailing and trading, and he stopped on the island of Cyprus. And while he was there, he decided to buy a figurine of the goddess Aphrodite. So as he was sailing back to Egypt, his ship was overcome by a horrible storm, and they thought they were going down. So he and the sailors begged to the goddess to save them. And thankfully, Aphrodite obliged, and they made it back to Egypt unscathed. So the first thing they did when they got back is they went straight to Naukratis, dedicated the figurine to the sanctuary of Aphrodite, and then had a feast that night with all of their friends. And I love this story because not only does it connect so well with the archaeological material, but it's such an important reminder that a Greek trader could dedicate a Cypriot object. Right? The place of origin of an object doesn't necessarily need to be the same as the identity of someone who used it. And of course, the sheer volume of Cypriot objects also raises an important question of how do we see non-Greeks at the site? Right? Cypriots themselves could well have dedicated these objects, but they don't use the Greek practice of inscribing their names. So this is always a challenge. How do we see identity in material culture? So of course, Naukratis isn't just importing. Naukratis is also producing. And this gives us a little bit of insight into the people who came and settled here. So we have objects that were produced seemingly both for local communities, local consumption, but also for export. So I'm going to show you 3 of these local workshops. The first is the workshop of immigrant East Greek potters who came and used local Nile silt clay to create vessels that were very similar in shape and sometimes decoration to what they knew from home. So these include the South Ionian cup. This is the same one we already saw dedicated to Apollo. But on the bottom, I have a very similar version, same shape, but rendered in the local Egyptian clay, presumably by a Greek potter. They also use their own decorative motifs at times, even though the materials in Egypt are a little bit harder to work with. So on the top, we have a North Ionian plate that was imported, and then a local variant on the bottom, presumably by immigrant Greek craftsmen. We have other types of production waste as well. One of my other favorite types of finds are these tiny little tubes, which maybe are not that assuming at first. But these are actually the core of stone vessels that sort of come out to make the tube where you would put the perfume. And we call these drill cores. And they were actually found, hundreds of them, reused in a pavement inside the Apollo Sanctuary. So these types of small perfume vessels, which also would have been filled with different oils and then shipped out to the Mediterranean from the site. And here at the villa, one more villa connection. We have this really beautiful example of another alabastron. So that same shape we already saw, but this time rendered in faience, a sort of glazed vitreous composition that's often brightly colored blues and greens and yellows. And this material has a very, very long tradition in Egypt. But by this point, it was already being produced also in Greece, like this example here. And many of these are decorated with Egyptianizing motifs, so things that look Egyptian but were not produced by Egyptians themselves. And I think pieces like this really demonstrate that there was a demand for these types of objects in and around the Mediterranean, and that a site like Naukratis could really capitalize on these markets. So we're going to go back to that one site I mentioned. This is just in the north of the Aphrodite Sanctuary, where Petrie found what he called the scarab factory. And he called it the factory because he found hundreds of molds for faience objects, chunks of raw material, and other types of production waste. So some of these objects, like this alabastron that we have here, were probably targeted towards Greek markets. So some of these have themes that you wouldn't see in Egyptian art normally. So this is a Greek chimera rendered on a scarab. But beyond these, and this tends to be the focus, the Egyptologist Aurelia Masson-Berghoff has studied all these amulets, and we have a huge range of amulets as well. These almost all depict traditional Egyptian protective figurines, which are associated with particularly women, with children, and safety during childbirth. So we have two different markets at the same time. And this leads me into the last stop on our whistle-stop tour of the site, the Amun-Ra Sanctuary in the south. And I think it's important to look at the map again to give you a sense of how large this is. I mean, this really looms over the site. And this is actually some of the only architecture that's still above ground, or chunks of this very, very large wall. And I think the Amun-Ra Sanctuary is a very important reminder that even though we think of Naukratis as a Greek site, it is also an Egyptian site with an Egyptian name, Naukraj. And we have to think of that location of Naukratis, right? It was right next to the capital of Sais, and that's not a coincidence. And the two were probably originally connected by a canal. And why was it so close to Sais? An inscription inside the sanctuary from a later pharaoh of a different dynasty, but it records that 1/10 of everything coming to Naukratis, so gold, silver, and all the things produced here, were taken as the king's domain, which is a nice way of saying that they were taxed. So it's a good reminder that Naukratis and Naukraj was both an Egyptian emporion or port of trade, but also an Egyptian royal harbor, and this was a mutually beneficial agreement for both groups. And of course, the Amun-Ra Sanctuary reminds us that there was probably an Egyptian community here too. And some of those objects I showed you, like those stone perfume vessels, like those amulets, some of these were actually found in trenches just outside the sanctuary. In fact, these exact pieces. And instead of always being sent abroad, some of these must have been used at home by local Egyptian communities, possibly looking for protection at challenging moments in life, right? So things like childbirth and the rearing and protection of children. So that's leaving the 19th century excavations behind. They impart, these excavations have given us an incredible wealth of information about the site. But at the same time, as we've already seen a little bit, we have to be aware there are some limitations to this type of data as well. And the first is that the types of objects, those 18,000 objects, obviously are not a perfectly representative sample of what they found at the site, right? You always have to, you're picking and choosing which objects to keep. So these older excavations Probably unsurprisingly, right? They prioritized figural things, inscribed objects, and things, I would say, things you might see in a museum, right? So anything kind of plain or unpainted wouldn't generally have been collected, maybe unless it was complete. And at times, we also see a bit of a bias towards Greek material, because Naukratis is so famous as a Greek site. And we actually know in some of the excavation diaries, because we hear the excavators recording what they bought and didn't buy from the Sabakin. And David George Hogarth at some point says, the small Egyptian stuff is worthless, right? And I think these are probably things like the amulets you just saw, right? There must have been hundreds of them. And even though we know, like I showed you, that some of these objects come from specific sanctuaries, so Apollo, Aphrodite, Hera, Dioskouroi, Amun-Ra, there's a lot more where we simply don't know where it came from at the site. We don't have the original archaeological context of many of these objects, simply not done the same way as it would be today. And a final note, and something I feel very strongly about, is even though these excavations are maybe not up to modern standards, it's a really difficult place to work. The conditions are really tough, especially in the Delta, which is a very saturated landscape, which you will see and understand imminently. So this most recent project that I've been so privileged to be involved in for the last 10 or so years, the British Museum Naukratis was started long before my time by Alexandra Villing, first to regather and restudy all of these 19th century excavations. So these objects which had been dispersed all around the world, which are now found all online on the British Museum's online research catalog. So you can search them all in one complete database, which is extremely helpful. New field work was started in 2012 and directed by Ross Thomas, and we had our last season in 2019. Now, a site like Naukratis really requires a multidisciplinary team. So I come from a background as Greek archaeology, as a Greek ceramicist, more specifically, but this team includes Egyptologists, Cypriot archaeologists, maritime archaeologists, geologists, botanical specialists, faunal specialists, and it's really, truly a team effort. And even though this project encompasses a few different research questions and methodologies, I'm just going to mostly show you the excavation material, mostly to think about how archaeology helps us enrich our picture of the site. First, through new categories of objects that wouldn't have been collected in the 19th century, but also by considering these objects in their archaeological context, both at Naukratis and then within the wider world of the Nile Delta. So as you saw, this is the area of the 19th century excavation, and most of this is gone. It's either surrounded by the lake or the modern village. So all of these red areas are excavation trenches, but we're very limited in where we could work. You can see why. And I'm going to show you an area of the Dioskouroi sanctuary and an area of the ancient riverfront. I said you have to use a lot of imagination because this is what it looks like today. I promise that's where those trenches are. So again, you have to use your imagination. The water would have been the town, and where I'm standing in this photo would have been the Nile. So you're pretty much standing in the river. And these where our trenches are. So a very limited space in which to work between the modern road and town and this sort of seasonal lake that was created by archaeologists. So I'm going to start with the Dioskouroi sanctuary. And this was excavated first in 1886. This is the sanctuary to the twin horsemen, Castor and Pollux, who, like we heard from Aphrodite, protected seafarers. And according to the 7th century BC poem, they easily rescue men from chilling death at sea. And this sanctuary, as you can see, was not terribly well preserved. You can see how badly preserved the architecture was. And we have very scanty remains of the actual mud brick structures, but some fragments of this painted plaster. You can see the beautiful blue meander on this piece. So probably this colorful plaster covering the mud brick building that doesn't survive. And we have similar types of objects that we saw from the other sanctuaries. So inscribed, imported Greek pottery mentioning the Dioskouroi, and in fact, some of that locally made Greek-style pottery. And again, this is what this trench area looks like today. So we're just at the edge of the lake. And in terms of stratigraphy, we're very deep, right? So we're at the very lowest levels where the excavators in the 19th century had already stopped. And we're actually a little bit to the north of what they mapped as the boundary walls. So in 2015, the excavators in Trench 10 encountered this small pocket of material from the sanctuary mixed up with some ash layers and animal bones. Hopefully that sounds a little bit familiar. So probably something similar to what we see in the Aphrodite sanctuary, but this is on a pretty small scale. This is not big. And we think this is probably a pit to clear old votive offerings and also debris from ritual activity, so animal sacrifice and feasting. It was kind of gathered up and collected, perhaps as some kind of rebuilding activity. And up out of the ground, hopefully, these look familiar to you. We have Cypriot figurines, but for the first time attested in the Dioskouroi sanctuary. We only had them in the others before. We have more East Greek pottery, one of which has a dedication to the Dioskouroi, so it's how we know where we are. And also we have a group, more of these locally produced East Greek style ceramics, two of which also have dedications to the Dioskouroi, very helpful for an archaeologist. But we also have groups of finds that probably wouldn't have been collected in the 19th century, including local Saite period Egyptian ceramics. So the top piece is what we call a saucer bowl or shallow dish, or in this case, a saucer lamp. So if you see the little white arrow I've left, there's a little dark spot on the edge. And you could just put a wick over this shallow bowl and use it as a lamp. The one on the bottom is what we call probably an incense burner. It also has a very grayish residue on the inside. And again, these are not Greek, they're not painted, they're not decorated, so they probably wouldn't have been collected in the 19th century, but they are so important to show us how what we consider traditionally Egyptian material culture could come to be used in a Greek sanctuary context. And another new category finds are animal bones, which were studied by Louise Bertini. And if we remember the story of Herostratus, who has a banquet within the Aphrodite sanctuary when he makes it safely home, we can also imagine that other sailors feasted here in the sanctuary of the Dioskouroi, who also saved them from chilling death at sea. Most of these bones belong to sheep and goats, but also have some fragments of pig. And if you think you see a lot of teeth in here, you'd be correct, because we have a lot of cranium fragments. So this is probably, the discard from butchery, not the part that people are eating. And finally, one of my favorite types of animal bone, it looks like people were also sampling the local seafood, because we have a few fragments from Nile catfish as well, which have the best skeletons, in my opinion. And for our final stop of this tour, I'm going to take you down to the riverfront, where the ships coming down the Nile would have stopped, docked, loaded, and unloaded their cargo. And as I said, you have to use your imagination and flip this. So what was the water was once the town. Where I'm standing would be the Nile. And given this area, it doesn't have monumental architecture, doesn't have votive dedications, no sanctuaries, no temples, or anything like that. This wasn't a particular focus of early excavations. But by putting in 4 trenches in this area, we were able to capture a sequence of activity going all the way from the early 6th down to the start of the 4th century BCE, which gives us evidence of how this busy riverfront area was actually used by the people who were walking between their ships and the town. And if any of you know what an archaeological site looks like, you probably are not surprised that we overwhelmingly have ceramics. So many ceramics. These riverfront trenches are particularly rich as well. So just one of them had over 7,000 individual fragments of pottery coming out of it. It's a lot. And of course, processing this volume of material is monumental. It takes a lot of time and effort. And as a ceramicist, I'm so grateful to the members of the team who spent all day working in the fields and would come home and immediately start washing and sorting pottery pretty much until we all fell asleep. Finally, we make a selection of these objects for studying, photography, drawing, and then finally publication. So obviously, I could talk for a long time about pottery, but I'm going to spare you, and I'll just give you a few highlights, mostly about how these new finds actually can help us have a more holistic view than the more limited selection from our earlier excavations. So back to some of these materials from earlier excavations. We've already seen some of these things, like the East Greek painted pottery with votive dedications. Oh no, Ruined my order. Okay, this is what we have from old excavations. Pretend like you didn't see that. We have East Greek painted pottery. We have production from other famous centers, Athens and Corinth and Laconia. We have Cypriot figurines, so decorated, inscribed, figural. But from new excavations, surprise, we also have fine tableware imports, things that are banded, plain black glazed, or not painted at all. And this type of material probably wouldn't have been collected, again, unless it was inscribed. And this allows us to represent a few new regions. So for example, you see Cilicia on the southern coast of Anatolia. Another hugely important category of finds are the transport amphoras. So these are really large, heavy, sturdy, two-handled storage vessels, which were filled with commodities, particularly like wine and olive oil. And they were designed so they could be easily packed into ships. This is the cargo container, the shipping container of the ancient world. And not many of these were kept from previous excavations, except this example I have, because it's complete. Otherwise, only bits that had inscriptions or were stamped were kept. But now with this much, much more thorough study of all the amphora fragments, we can really illustrate the full extent of these trade networks to new places. So East Greece, where we already saw, has a lot of the amphoras from here. We also have examples going far to the west, so Corinth and Corcyra, Thasos and Mende up to the north, Cyprus and the Levant to the east. And we already saw some of these fragments of local Greek-style ceramics, but also importantly, we have a full range of Egyptian Saite ceramics, which were made very much in a local Egyptian tradition. And again, that's material that wouldn't have been of much interest in earlier years. Another new group is cooking vessels. Some of these were imported, actually, from places like Aegina, which is an island close to Athens. It's a very well-traveled cooking pot. And we also have ceramic grinding bowls for food preparation from Cyprus. And then, of course, the locally produced cooking repertoire, which includes shapes derived from both Greek and Egyptian and Cypriot traditions. And of course, ceramics are really only one part of the story, right? We're missing many, many more things. The perishable goods that don't survive in the archaeological records, so things like linen, papyrus, or grain. But thanks to the very soggy conditions along the riverfront, we do have some fragments of wood. And these were studied by Ross Thomas, a maritime archaeologist. And these are fragments of ship planks that were probably cut off as part of maintenance. So we can imagine it's not just unloading and loading, but people pausing to take a break and repair their ships before they set back out to sea. So in addition to what these objects themselves tell us, I want to end by looking at some of these objects in their archaeological context, in their specific find spot along the stretch of the Nile River. So if any of you are familiar with Egypt, you might know about the Nile inundation. And this is a very significant event when the Nile River bursts its banks and floods the landscape. And as part of this, dumps these very rich river silts all over the valley and the whole of the delta. So this annual inundation plays a central role in Egyptian religion and is absolutely critical for the incredible fertility of the land. The Greek historian Herodotus even talks about it. He's very interested in the Nile, and he comments on this event, noting how the waters don't just cover the whole delta, but go 2 more days in either direction. And yes, this watery landscape was very fertile, but if you are a trader, it's also something that's quite difficult to navigate, both then and now, with the river constantly shifting, leaving behind waterlogged soils and soft, muddy embankments. So when we find ceramics, like those transport amphoras, at times, they are not just thrown into the water, but they are very deliberately laid horizontally, creating an ad hoc pavement along the surface. So these are Cypriot transport amphoras, about 300-something fragments all laid down in a layer in the middle of the 6th century BC. So creating a surface that would keep you dry as you walked without sinking into that sticky mud. And at some point in the late 5th century BC, and you have to see these photos to understand what I mean by waterlogged conditions, we have 4 nearly complete East Greek transport amphoras placed in a line along the riverfront, shoved into the muddy ground, and then packed with more broken ceramics to create an artificial bank that was stable and dry for walking. Again, and I hope these photos do give you a sense of how waterlogged the environment could be and the kind of conditions that faced these Greek traders when they were trying to move their transport amphoras or other goods between the boats and the town. And finally, I want you to just, so you can see them when they came out of the ground and they were reconstructed by Wendy Reed. And I really think that this installation is probably my favorite of the new finds for a couple different reasons. First, because these aren't necessarily the glamorous objects we see in a museum. These are broken, they are muddy, they're plain storage vessels. But despite this humble appearance, they testify to these long-lasting connections between Greece and Egypt, even a century after the Saite Dynasty, sort of late 5th century. And the way these objects, which had already probably circuited the Mediterranean more than once, refilled and emptied multiple times, took on a second life when they came to Egypt, becoming a permanent part of the Nile landscape. And above all, this installation really makes me imagine the people who walked along the banks of the Nile. Maybe they sunk into the mud a few too many times and decided to make the most of the materials they had and use them in a creative way, adapting what they had to this new environment. And I hope with this in your mind, you can start to better imagine some of the people who created and used the objects that you can go see in the villa today. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful lecture. We now have a few moments to take questions, and we will alternate between questions from our Zoom audience and our in-house audience. For those of you who are in-house, there will be someone with a microphone walking around, so please wait until you have the mic in your hand to pose your question so that everyone, including our Zoom audience, can hear your question. But we'll start with one from the Zoom audience, which is about the mud brick architecture. So you're excavating mud brick architecture in essentially mud, and there isn't any longer, any superstructures visible on the surface of the land. So how are you finding the remnants of this architecture as you're digging?
Yes, that is, if anyone has ever been to the Nile Delta and seen sites, this is maybe not what you imagine when you think of Egyptian archaeology, right? It's not the dry desert. So we did encounter a few bits of mud brick architecture in our excavations, but as Sarah mentioned, the same mud, so the reason those mud bricks were collected for agriculture is that they're made with that same Nile silt. So they're very rich, organic, and very good for fertilizer. So it means that it's very difficult to differentiate the mud brick from the surrounding mud. But one technique, I actually cut this, so thank you for including this. Another technique that I didn't have time to talk about was this geophysical survey that was also conducted. This is a type of technique where we use magnetometry, so differences in the Earth's magnetic field. If there's something underground that's magnetic, these machines, these gradiometers, will bounce back and tell you that there's something under the surface, right? So you walk through these different fields, and it will sort of bounce back a signal if it's hitting something. So this is not excavation, right? We're not digging this up. This is just a type of way maybe to sort of see a little bit underground. So all this gray area represents fields where our magnetometry team, so Ross Thomas, Kristra, and Ellie Ma, all were bravely walking through many fields in different conditions. And what's really interesting about this so far, which might be a little hard to see, but if you see all the gray structures, they tend to be this sort of grid shape. And this is a very, very common type of architecture in the Nile Delta. It's what we call casemate architecture. So it's these small cells that get filled with kind of rubble and debris. And in the magnetometry, you can sometimes see these little grid patterns. So you're actually looking at what must be a mud brick building underground. Again, these aren't excavated. You can't say what date they are. But what I like is it gives us a sense of what the town might have looked like. This very dense occupied area full of houses of traditional Egyptian style. So not just sanctuaries floating in the middle of nowhere, but as part of a very dense urban landscape. So again, I'm also happy to talk more about that if anyone's interested in architecture.
In the recreation of Naukratis, there were buildings in the front that looked like they had 4 rows of windows. Did they have 4-story buildings?
Well, oh, okay. They're tower house. Yes, they're tall. They're very tall. So this is the type. Okay. Well, thank you for asking another architecture question. Yes. So this is a very common type of building. So as you see, the soil here is very wet. So a lot of the architecture is about making sure most of what you have is elevated, right? So say you're storing grain or something, you don't want it to get wet. You don't want it to get moist, and the soil is very moist. So this seems to be a common building technique in the Delta. You make these kind of cellular shapes, and then you pack them in. This is not from Naukratis, but this hopefully will give you an idea, right? There's kind of tall, skinny houses, which are called tower houses. And this is very, very common in the Nile Delta, especially in the late period. And I think it's just really, I like this because it's a reminder, right, that this is an Egyptian town as well, in Egypt, in the Nile Delta, in this particular moment in time. It's not just floating Greek sanctuaries in the middle of nowhere. So this is why we use a lot of reconstructions, because it's a little bit difficult to see otherwise. But hopefully that gives you a sense. And yes, they definitely were a few stories tall, and we have other models like this too. Thank you.
Great, and from Zoom, we have a question about the people at Naukratis. Do we have any sense of to what extent the mercenaries, the artists, the tradespeople coming to Naukratis might have been bringing Greek families with them, women and children? Are these men coming in and marrying into local Egyptian families? Is it both? And is there any evidence that gives us a sense of what the patterns might be?
Yeah, one issue is a lot of these inscriptions we see, they are really chronologically specific. So I mentioned all these names we have, right? The practice of inscribing really drops off even in the second half of the 6th century. So one of the difficulties is knowing what happens over time. But presumably, yes, we have some women, we have Greek women. Actually, in Herodotus, he says Naukratis is very famous for its courtesans. So there's a very famous story of a courtesan. And if any of you know the Greek poet Sappho, her brother apparently got very, very enamored of this courtesan and bought her freedom. So it was known for some women like that, but we assume they also must have brought their families. But it's these other people that are a lot harder to see. In other places in Egypt, we might have things like papyri that talk about mixed marriages or these grave stelae. But we don't have as many gravestones. We don't have the same papyrus evidence, right? So I think it's probably safe to assume that some people absolutely did. We have later names of people who have Greek parents, but Egyptian names, like we already saw. We have a statue from about 300 BC of someone named Horemheb who has Greek parents. But it is difficult because the nature of our evidence is different at this site. We have this burst of inscriptions, all this maybe first generation of East Greeks in the sanctuaries, and then it really tapers off a lot more. And it's much harder to know with certainty what happens in the later generations. But I think based on what we know from sites like Memphis, that it's very, very likely and very plausible, right, that they married Egyptians and had children from mixed cultural backgrounds. I think that makes perfect sense.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. What is known about these Greeks who immigrated to Egypt? Like, why did they do that? Why did they immigrate? And the second related question is, you showed some Greek architecture.
Yeah.
Did they bring those limestones with them from Greece? How did they find those limestones in Egypt?
The marble is probably from Ephesus, I think, is the best bet. The limestone, I actually don't know off the top of my head if that was imported or came from somewhere closer. But to your first question, I think, merchants and mercenaries, it's profitable, right? If you are getting rewarded with all these honors and you're given land and titles by the Egyptian pharaoh, I think it's, it makes sense as a career path, right? There's really great opportunities. We actually have an inscription from a Greek. He is dedicating an Egyptian statue back home in Greece. So this is found in Ionia, and he talks about how he was rewarded with gold in a city from the pharaoh. So they could achieve very high status and great wealth. And on the trading end, Egypt is so wealthy. Egypt is always known as wealthy, and it's full of natural resources, so other things that I didn't mention. So things like alum and natron, which are used in craft production, are from the area, obviously metals, all these types of rich agricultural materials, grain, all come from Egypt. And if we look at kind of earlier sources, we know in the Greek world, they know Egypt is very wealthy, right? So it's a very excellent opportunity if you can get into this port and trade. This is massive because you tap a huge market. And as we saw from all these Egyptianizing objects in the Mediterranean, there's a demand for Egyptian objects and all kinds of other materials. So I think it's a great this is a world where Greeks are moving around all the time and taking advantage of different opportunities and also making settlements in other places. So they're going to the west, they're going to Italy and Sicily, they're going to the Black Sea, they're going all over in search of opportunities. I think they're very adventurous.
Great. So from Zoom, we have a question that actually builds really nicely on what you were just saying about the movement of Greeks, which is about the nature of Naukratis as a Greek colony. Is it similar, or do we see any patterns here that are similar to what we find at other Greek colonies or trading ports around the Mediterranean? Is it totally unique?
Yeah.
How does it compare?
That's a great question. This also ties into a little bit, I think, what I was hinting at with the archaeological approaches to the site, right? We think of this as a Greek settlement, and a later Greek author actually calls it a Milesian colony. So for a long time, people will call it a Greek colony, which I think if you see the level of kind of control and involvement in the Egyptian state is not quite accurate. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's so important to remember it's not just Naukratis, it's Naukraj. So it's set up by the Egyptian state. So the Greeks wouldn't get away with kind of sailing in and claiming this land for themselves. It wouldn't work like that in Egypt. You can't do that. So it's a very unique case. It is very different than other sites, called the traditional areas of Greek colonization. Maybe a more similar comparison, I don't know Etruria as well, but be Griviska, which is in Etruria, which also has different Greek sanctuaries. But it's not setting out to a totally new place without kind of an established sort of economic structure, right? They're coming into somewhere where the Saite pharaohs are powerful and centralized. So I think it's a mutually beneficial arrangement, and I think it's a little bit different than what you might see in other places that don't have the Egyptian state that you're dealing with on the other end. I think that's why it's important to remember that Amun-Ra sanctuary. It's always there, right? It's always looming over the Greek settlement.
Hello, thank you for your lecture.
Oh, hi.
I was just wondering, in terms of the custody of the actual fragment pieces that have been found, are they going over to the British Museum, or are they being retained within Egypt and Greece where you're finding them?
Yeah, so this is all in Egypt, and nothing leaves Egypt. So hence why we stay up very, very late at night working, right? You can't take it home. It belongs to Egypt. It stays in Egypt in the local storerooms. In the 19th century, so just to be clear, in the 19th century excavations, this was obviously a different time. And the reason that they got distributed so widely is this is part of the way the Egypt Exploration Society worked, is different society chapters around the world sent in funds. They got distributed for excavations, and then when objects came back, they would get sent out to local societies. And that's why they're in so many places. So those first couple seasons are everywhere. So that's why there's some in the US. So there's pieces from the site in places like Boston. But yes, all the new excavations, it's a very different story. It absolutely stays there. And so we study everything on site at the moment, which makes it difficult. But yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for about two more questions.
Sure.
So we'll do one Zoom, one in audience. So we have another Zoom question that also builds on what you were just saying about the dispersal of the material. People are curious how much of the finds ended up in the Petrie Museum in London versus in other collections.
Off the top, because this is there. If you go onto the online research catalog, there is an amazing pie chart showing where everything went. Which I don't know off the top of my head what went to the Petrie Museum. About half is in the British Museum. And then there's really big chunks in Oxford and Cambridge. So in the Ashmolean and the Cambridge Museum of Classical Archaeology, or the Fitzwilliam, are probably the biggest institutions. In the US, the MFA at Boston has a pretty substantial collection, because if you imagine the people donating at different universities in the area, the MFA becomes the kind of recipient point for them there. But I don't know what percentage is in the Petrie Museum. I don't think it's particularly big. I think most of the London is in the British Museum. But as I said, I know there is a very, very good pie chart where they've tracked down the exact numbers of where these are distributed. It's impressive.
Okay, we'll take one final in-audience question.
I had a question about what they assume the population was at its peak.
Yeah, that's a great question. That was part of also this survey, right? Because as opposed to just this core, which was excavated, we can sort of get a sense of the overall settlement of the site, and it seems to be roughly about 60 hectares, and that would be estimated about maybe 15,000 people, so far as we can tell from the survey. So a pretty substantial site. And again, where there seems to be really people living, right? Not just sanctuaries by themselves, but a real population. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
All right, well, that seems like a good place to conclude. So please join me in thanking our speaker one more time for her wonderful lecture.